Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean Egan. I'm the Deputy Director for Labor here in Leo, and welcome back to our webinar series where we focus in on workplace mental health. There is a Q&A box at the top of your screen that you can submit questions to at any time throughout today's presentation. We'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. If you haven't already, please make sure you sign up for our emails at michigan.gov/workplace mental health. That also includes all the recordings of webinars that we've done, links to all the resources and information, our report, the Surgeon General's report, and more. That's usually where we're trying to update and upload information. And as you all know, our goal is to provide working people and employers with information about issues impacting our workplaces, the impacts to our mental health, and options for addressing these issues. In a lot of our work as the Department of Labor, we focus in on this concept of chronic stress and kind of how that impacts people's ability to move forward, how it can lead people to things like anxiety, depression, addiction, other chronic health issues. And we've identified what we call 3 pillars that are things impacting our mental health that are happening in the workplace, things affecting the workplace. So that's experiences you may have outside of work that are coming in with you. And then certainly connections to those individual behavioral health supports, because we all have to take an affirmative step to make sure that we're taking care of our mental health and well-being. We try to make sure that we hit on these pillars and vary with the various content that we do throughout the webinar series, and that we don't really tag what we're talking about that month, but this month clearly is about impacts in the workplace and what that does for people's health and well-being. And I can tell you, in my presentations around the state with working people and employers, we can't stress enough how certain conditions that happen at work can detrimentally impact the mental well-being of individuals. It cranks up that stress response. It can even re-trigger trauma that people have experienced in their lives. And it's important that we recognize this and we work on identifying it and fixing it. So today we're talking with one of our great friends, Michelle Kaminsky, who is an associate professor and associate director for undergraduate programs at Michigan State University. She's also a PhD in organizational psychology. She was on our original work group that helped develop our workplace mental health report. She is part of what I always lovingly refer to as the kitchen cabinet that meets monthly to talk about what we're doing in Leo, what we could do better, what directions we might need to go. And today she's going to share what she's researched extensively and taught on extensively, this concept of bullying and abusive managers or supervisors and how that impacts us at work. So I'll turn it over to you, Michelle, and thanks again for joining us today.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I'm really happy to be here today, and I really appreciate all the work that you and Leo do on these important mental health issues. And as you say, today we're going to talk specifically about mental health in the workplace, about bullying and abusive supervision. And all right, my slides are not clicking. There we are. Okay, sorry about that. So first we'll talk a little, this is the agenda. We'll talk about what they are and how common they are, and then we'll really focus on the costs and what we can do about them. Because from my point of view, this is something, it's really widespread and it's really costly. And it's really costly to both individuals and to organizations. And so I think really as workplace leaders, as union leaders, we really need to do something about this. And I know it's something that has a very real impact on a lot of people. So first of all, what is workplace bullying? We're academics. We have academic definitions of them. This one comes from the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, that bullying involves repeated, unwanted, harmful actions that humiliate, offend, harm, undermine, degrade, and that they cause lasting damage. And so the second half of this definition basically says something that I think is really important, that bullying involves a misuse of power. And unfortunately about it, it can become kind of normal and normalized in a lot of workplaces. And one of the things that I would really like to see is for this to be less normalized. And so just examples of the kinds of things we're talking about, it's being rude, it's being dismissive, it's being screaming and yelling at people, overly criticizing people personally, not for their work performance, but for who they are, for their families, gossiping about them, things like that. And bullying can also take the form of sabotaging people's work so that they don't have the information that they need to do their jobs. And I know that one thing about bullying is that it's really common in some occupations, including nursing, for example. And think about this. If you have a loved one in the hospital, or you're in the hospital, do you want a nurse not to have the information that they need to do their job? So it has an impact not just on the individual worker, but on a lot of other folks as well. And when we talk about abusive supervision, for me, it's very similar. It's a supervisor who's a bully. And the definition that we have for this that's used in the academic literature, the extent to which a supervisor engages in the sustained display of hostile verbal and nonverbal behaviors. And that says excluding physical contact. When we talk about bullying, it does actually usually include a definition that includes violence or threats of violence. But important thing from the employer's point of view, though, is a supervisor who gives someone a negative performance review, that does not necessarily count as bullying, as long as they deliver that information in kind of an even-handed and a fair way and a constructive way. So they talk about the work that needs to be changed and improved and how the work needs to be improved, rather than particularly attacking the individuals in question. So a question that people often have is just how common is workplace bullying, and unfortunately super common. So this data is from an organization called the Workplace Bullying Institute, and every few years they run a national representative sample about the extent of workplace bullying. And frankly, the needle hasn't really changed very much. When we look at this data over the years, what we typically see is about a third of the workforce is affected directly, is the target of bullying at some point in their work career. So we see in this version, this is the 2021 survey, 13% say they're currently being bullied and 17% say they've been bullied in the past. But there's another group that's affected by it, which is those who are witnesses. They can experience some stress and some negative consequences as well, perhaps not as extreme as the target of the bullying, but it affects them as well. And new in the 2021 study, about 4% of the people who completed the survey actually admitted to performing behaviors that would count as workplace bullying. So when we add up that 30% who are a target and 20% who witnesses, that's 49%. That's half the workforce that is affected by workplace bullying. And you can look at sort of who does it in a lot of different ways, but basically it's most typically bosses, someone's direct supervisor. 65% of the time, someone reports that the bully is their boss. It's not the only way that it goes. Coworkers bully each other sometimes, 21%. And less common, we see people who are in a lower hierarchical position who have some kind of leverage and are able to bully people who rank above them in the organization. And a thing that really surprised me during the pandemic, I really thought that as we move to more remote work for many people, and of course I know that totally depends on what kind of job you have and what industry you're in, but a lot of industries move to more remote work. And I thought, oh, this will put more distance between people and we'll see less bullying. But this really wasn't what happened. We saw more bullying in more active bullying. So instead of 13% being bullied at the time, 43% were saying they were bullied as part of their remote work. And most of it was happening in meetings. And again, I was surprised because I thought, well, these Zoom meetings, team meetings, they're a little more formal oftentimes, and people tend to be a little more aware that other people are watching them during these meetings. And I thought that formality and that distance would put people a little more on their kind of best behavior. They'd be more polite, but that really turned out not to be the case, and that the reports are that that remote workers were really subject to more bullying than others were. And although one thing that did hold is that when bullying happens in an email, that helps provide a paper trail that sometimes helps us to deal with it at an organizational level. Okay, so what can we do about it? one of the issues with workplace bullying is we don't really have, we don't have any national or statewide laws that say this is against the law. So the only time that it's illegal is when you can demonstrate that the bullying is essentially harassment based on protected class. So a group that has anti-discrimination laws to protect them. So if someone can demonstrate that bullying is actually based on race or gender or age or religion or disability status or those protected class things, then one could proceed using anti-discrimination legislation and say that it's illegal because of that. But most of the time, that's really just not what bullying is about. It's really about one person trying to exert their will over another person in a way that's considered excessive, offensive, inappropriate, etc. And there is somewhat of a movement to create new legislation. There's legislation in other countries, in Australia, for example, in Quebec, a little closer to home. But we don't, as I said, we don't have any national or statewide legislation. The bill that's called the Healthy Workplace Bill, it's been introduced in a number of state legislatures, but it's going to be some time, I think, before that's passed anywhere in the United States, although we do see some municipalities trying to either implement policies or actually pass laws for the municipality as an employer to deal with workplace bullying. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what are the consequences of bullying. I want to emphasize that for the target of the bullying, the consequences can be really pretty, very stressful, very dramatic, and have a really difficult impact on their a really negative, harmful impact on their mental health. So it's pretty common to see symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I know many of us tend to think of PTSD as something you get or that people get as a result of being in a war or some other sort of truly extraordinary situation. But it can also be a result of the sort of everyday, day in, day out pressures and abuses that may not be as dramatic as being in a war zone, but are still, because they happen day in and day out, they still have an impact on people. It's common to have symptoms of depression, trouble sleeping, strained relationships. But the other thing that I think most of us who teach in this field have had is we've heard stories, we've had people talk to us, we've had survivors talk to us about suicide risk related to as a result of workplace bullying. And it's, we don't have exactly the same level of hard documentation, but I will tell two stories related to that. One, a story from Michigan. When I was teaching a session about workplace bullying, one of the participants came up to me and told me about a situation that they themselves had been in where they were being bullied by a boss in their workplace. And the boss was an in-law, and this was a family firm. So getting away from the family meant separation, it meant leaving the organization. And of course, it would also jeopardize his personal relationships as well. And so they stayed. And, but it was just extraordinarily difficult, and it went on for a long period of time. And one night he was in a very serious single car accident, and he ended up with disability retirement as a result. But he came to me and he said, "You can share this story." He said he looks back at it and views it essentially as a suicide attempt. And he wants people to know that if they're in this situation, they should get out before it ends up like that. And I can also tell you of a situation in another Midwestern state where that someone who was the target of bullying had attempted suicide, and sometime later, the supervisor said to them, "Well, why don't you try it again and this time finish the job?" So we see really just heart-wrenching, horrible stories related to workplace bullying that have this really dramatic effect on people's mental health. So I don't want anyone to underestimate how big a problem it is for the individual. On their work side, they become less productive because they're worried about protecting themselves all the time. How can I make sure that I don't get beat up today becomes kind of like the number one point of view, the number one issue. And so, and also if their boss is the person who bullies them, then when they perform really well, they might outshine the boss, and then the boss might bully them more. So that limits their opportunities to move elsewhere in the organization because other people aren't able to see their talents and their abilities because they're hiding it themselves so that they won't get bullied anymore. So the consequences for individuals are really pretty dramatic, but it's true that the consequences for organizations are really dramatic too. And it's been hard to get a good estimate, and I've been doing some research on this, and this is one that I feel fairly comfortable with. This would be presented, it was based on research that was done internationally, but this the number I've presented here is in US dollars, and current US dollars, and the overall estimate for the cost to employers per year, and if you put the whole US economy together, is 152 billion. And if we break that down, the things we can measure a little more easily: absenteeism, $23 billion in absenteeism as a result of workplace bullying, and the cost of turnover, 15 billion. But if you've heard Sean talk, I know he uses the term presenteeism a lot, which means people are in the workplace, but they're not really putting forth their best effort. They're withholding, and withholding might be the wrong word. Someone who's the target of bullying is, as I said, preoccupied with defending themselves because that is what their organizational life is like. And so they are unable to devote their full effort to doing the best job. And a measure of presenteeism is not going to be a perfect measure, but the estimate here is $114 billion a year. So organizations could be a lot more productive and a lot more successful if they address this problem. But quite frankly, we're not so good yet at addressing this problem. So in those Workplace Bullying Institute surveys, generally speaking, people say, the targets of bullying say, when they complain to management or they complain to HR, in 60% of the cases, management does nothing or makes it worse. So what does making it worse mean? Makes it worse means supporting the bully and just telling the bully that they're right. And I know that when I make these presentations to management groups and joint labor management groups, the HR people really don't appreciate my saying this. And I know that it's not that they want bullying to continue, but they often feel like either their hands are tied by the power structures of the organization, or that they simply don't have the tools they need to do something about it. And a little later, I'll talk a little more about what those tools might be. But common things that go wrong when management tries to adjust it, or to address bullying. So one of the biggest issues is that there's a particular kind of bully, and we use the phrase kiss up, kick down, that a bully who is particularly politically focused on getting ahead themselves is always very careful to present the best possible face to the people above them in the organization. So they flatter them, they take on projects that they think might help that person, and they're just always accommodating to the people above them. And then they turn around and treat either many of the people below them, or sometimes just that one target, really aggressively and hostilely. So if that target complains one level up, they're going to be complaining to people, say, oh, that person, they're so wonderful, they're always nice to me, how could they possibly be a bully? You must misunderstand. And so that's a really common outcome. And it's especially the case, many bullies, they bully one person at a time. Oftentimes bullying, it's not really about race, gender, or protected class. May fall that way, it may not, but often it's one person at a time. So the rest of the work group isn't experiencing the same thing. So when HR investigates, they see this, they have this majority minority thing. They see, okay, the supervisor supervises 10 people and 9 of them say it's okay and 1 doesn't. So is it about that one person? But really, that's not an uncommon scenario, and it's not okay that they're doing it to that one person, even though they're not doing it to the other 9. So sometimes management will appease the bully because they're powerful. Sometimes they'll investigate and they'll say, oh, it's just a personality conflict, and they'll blame both sides. Sometimes they'll blame the target. Sometimes they won't do anything. And as I say, HR, who may or may not want to deal with it, but if they're willing to deal with it, sometimes they don't have the tools, they don't have the authority to do what it takes. Also, other employees can sometimes do things, but may be afraid to, because for a number of reasons, including they're afraid that that supervisor is going to treat them like that if they say anything, or because they just accept what the leader has to say. The leader says, oh, you know, that target over there, he or she, they never do their job right. It causes problems for us all the time. And they just start to accept that, and they ostracize other people. So it's kind of hard for us to figure out in terms of data what really happens when organizations try to discipline someone for bullying. And what I'm showing here are results of a study that I did with my colleague Stacy Hickox, who's an attorney, and this was published in a law journal. And it's hard to get good information. So what we've looked at is kind of a subset of a set of cases, 112 cases that come from the unionized environment, because this kind of information is made public, that are based on arbitration decisions in which someone was accused of bullying and was disciplined for it, typically fired, and the union filed a case to try and get that person's job back, and it ends up in arbitration. And so this is most likely to be the peer-to-peer bullying, and rather than the supervisor to subordinate bullying, just because that's the kind of case that would end up in arbitration. And what we see here that, so we've separated the side on the left are cases where there was actual violence or threats of violence, and the side on the right is where the bullying was a little less extreme. It was verbal only. And in 63% of the cases with violence, the discharge was upheld by the arbitrator. So the bully had lost their job, and that the arbitrator upheld that. And in 28% of the cases, they were brought back to work, but still with some penalty, like they had a 1-week suspension, let's say. And then in 9% of the cases, the discipline was overturned and they were brought back to work with full pay. So on the side where the bullying was just verbal, the people were the discharge was upheld in 55% of the cases. So in these cases, we're seeing more than half of the time, arbitrators are upholding the discharge for discipline, even though we don't have a law about it, and even though there may not even be a policy in place about it. But what can we do to prevent bullying and to address it? So one thing is, this is very much a leadership issue. So research evidence shows that certain kinds of leadership are more likely to create an environment in which bullying occurs. And those are particularly laissez-faire leadership, where it's kind of an absenteeism kind of approach. But really, the leader has to say that it's important and they want it to stop. Because if they don't give anyone the authority to discipline people or to penalize them for bullying, then it's just going to continue. And although this phrase is not original to me, I like it a great deal. What you permit, you promote. So leaders often think that bullying thing, oh, it's just the two of them, it's a small problem, I don't want to deal with it, it's too complicated, it'll take too much time. But when you do that, you are saying it is okay for bullying to happen in this organization. So leaders have to stop doing that. And then you can create a policy, or you can bargain it in a collective bargaining agreement. Things to include that I've listed here: examples of both acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And I know we're short on time, so I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but there has to be enforcement and it has to be consistent. And the other thing, just like when we look at sexual harassment, we have to be sure, if we're doing something, that we punish the bully and not the target. So one of the things people will sometimes do is reassign the target someplace else. Sometimes the target will be very happy for that kind of resolution, because really what targets want, they just want it to stop. And so if they move someplace else, they may be moving someplace where they're not going to be bullied, someplace else within the organization. But the bully may very well start bullying someplace else. And of course, if you reassign the bully, they may start bullying someplace else, someplace else. So one really has to address the root of the problem. In the short term, things that not just other coworkers can do is help to reduce the face-to-face interactions with people, interrupt them by just saying, hey, did you see that Tiger game last night? Or we've been having nice weather lately, just change the subject. And other solutions that arbitrators have looked at and other people can look at, for example, are sending the bullies, requiring that the bullies get some kind of training, and or it may be training for anger management, it may be coaching and conflict resolution. Bullies aren't always open to this. I have to admit, it's a real problem. And a thing I recommend in general, the things on the right side, which are bigger picture things and hard to accomplish, are that we have joint health and safety committees for physical health and safety, and I recommend that we start creating them for mental health as well, and that bullying could be a thing that they could address. And some of you may be familiar with the concept of restorative justice, which helps to recreate a sense of a community after harm has created and focuses on the questions, what happened, who was harmed, and what can be done to fix it. And that can be a tool, that's a very time-intensive tool, but that can be a tool that's used to help resolve bullying circumstances. So I'm going to wrap up now, and basically my message is that both bullying and abusive supervision are very common in American workplaces and in workplaces around the globe. They're very costly and they can be preventable. It's not a quick fix, it's not an easy fix, it's more of a culture fix, but there are things that we can do about them. Cool. So that's the wrap up for me.
Yeah, I love the information, Michelle. Thank you so much for sharing. A lot of interest in this topic. We have a few great questions, so it'll be a little bit of rapid fire for you. The first and easy one that a few of them were is, yes, we will be sharing out this webinar after, and we'll be sharing out the slide presentation after. If you're on our email list, you'll see that in the next day or two, and then it gets posted to our website as well. So that'll all be available there. I do want to make two quick notes. I mean, what it sounds like to me is, hey, employers, you have to have a policy on this. There's not a law out there that's saying that covers all these situations, so you have to have a policy. Couple of examples. How can you minimize abuse/bullying in a production-driven job, like a production type job? What do you recommend there?
So in a production type job, so I think that this is a question of, it would help to know if we were talking about worker to worker or supervisor to subordinate. And so for the supervisor to subordinate, it has to be there has to be a policy, there has to be a message from above saying, okay, it's not okay to talk like that to your subordinates, to the people you supervise. And there has to be management saying to supervisors that, no, you can't do this. And that if it's worker to worker, it's difficult and it's challenging because typically workers don't want to, they don't want to get other workers in trouble. If there's a union environment, they can talk to their union, and maybe their union can offer some training, offer some insight. But you know, we change cultures. We do it intentionally. It takes time. I know when I started out, when I would go to collect data in a production environment, I would walk through a plant and see all kinds of pinup posters posted in many places throughout the workplace. And I don't see that anymore. We have made those kinds of changes. We've made those changes by telling people it's not okay and by disciplining people when it's appropriate. I'm a union person. I don't like to see people disciplined. But if we have a policy that says this behavior is unacceptable, and if you do this, this is the discipline you will get, then we need to do that, and we need to do it consistently, and we need to do it for management as well as for the workforce. And there should be degrees. We don't expect people to get fired for saying one offensive thing most of the time, unless it's extraordinarily severe. You want to take corrective action. You want to give people, you want to tell people this is no longer okay, and you want to give them a chance to get better.
Yeah, this is actually related to when we work together for a long time. You know, we get to know each other pretty well, and sometimes outside of work stuff comes into work and all that kind of stuff. So one of the questions, probably in both directions, is how do you handle bullying after work or outside of work, but it's work related to your relationship at work or the content of your work?
Well, that's a tough one. So, and again, it's a question of, is this peers? And so one thing is, especially when it comes to peers, the evidence is that if you stand up to the bully, they're going to back down. That's not necessarily the case when the bully is a supervisor, but when it's a peer, and I'm guessing that if it's after work, you're at least your peers in that environment, and the target has to say it's not okay. And the other, if you're out, a bunch of you are out somewhere after work, other people need to say that's not okay. The other people who are witnessing it, who feel awkward, who don't want to take sides, yeah, you got to say, hey, we don't talk like that around here.
Yeah, we have a few questions. If everybody's willing, we'll run over just a couple minutes as long as you have time, Professor. We have a few questions that are kind of, obviously people are experiencing things at work that are sort of linked to their own experiences. So I'll try to put them together on types of behaviors they're dealing with. One is, I continue to deliver feedback on their leadership and the treatment of staff in a constructive way, but they basically just ignore it or gaslight the person. Is that a form of abusive supervision? Give me one more second while I get to the other two.
I need clarification on that. Who's giving that feedback to who, I guess?
Subordinate to their manager is giving feedback to their manager about how they're treating team members, but they don't respond. They just gaslight them. Unfortunately for somebody, they have been ignored for the last 2 years, as in like not spoken to, not acknowledged, not anything. Is that a form of bullying?
Yeah.
One person said, why not just get rid of? It seems like bullies get promoted quite often. I don't know if you've ever found that in your research. What was there was one more here, but to the point, I mean, there's a lot of examples. How about if they just handpick somebody for a position rather than following posting procedures or something like that? Could that be a form of bullying? I think first out would be some favoritism too, but you know, depending on the situation, that could be some bullying, right?
So, okay, so all of the things you're describing to me are an environment in which bullying is, again, as I said, what you permit, you promote. It's being permitted by management above, and it can be very difficult for someone who is not in management to force a change in this way. So in terms of a subordinate giving a manager trying to give a manager feedback, well, I guess I would have to say, is there somewhere else? Who else can give that manager feedback? And the problem is, as I said, 60% of the time when somebody complains to management or HR about the bully, they do nothing or make it worse. And so one of the things I sometimes, not always, this depends on personal experience and personal situations, can you transfer somewhere else in the organization? And there have been circumstances where I say to people, can you think about looking for a different job? And I know people don't want to give up their jobs, but if an organization is over time not doing anything about it, they're not going to suddenly start. And so if you have you've taken these steps to deal with it, what other steps can you take? So you've talked to your supervisor who's misbehaving. If you talk to HR or your supervisor, will they do anything? It's a risk to do that. And if you do that once and nothing happens, I wouldn't do it again, just because in terms of protecting myself as an employee. One way to deal with it is to get, so if you're going to complain about it, you need documentation. You need documentation that is not just this person hurt my feelings and I felt bad about it, but is this person made it harder for me to do my job in this way and how, and they made it harder for other people to do their job in this way and how. And having, collecting evidence that involves other people and not just one individual is protective because it's collective action. And so that provides you a certain amount of legal protection in some ways. But but basically the organization has to want to do something about it. I'm going to move on to the second one, ignoring someone. Yes, we would say the word they would use in the academic literature is someone's ostracized, ignored.
Yeah.
And can you do your job that way? Do you get what you need to do your job? If you're not getting what you need to do your job, you need to tell someone in the chain of command that you're not getting what you need to do your job and you need it. Another thing I was going to say about the giving feedback to the manager, what kind of training can you get? And sometimes, I don't know if these things happen in one-on-one conversations or in meetings. A thing that we did in my workplace that I must admit I was skeptical of at first, but seemed to make a difference, is we agreed on a set of ground rules about meetings, and we agreed that it was not just the chair of the meeting, but everyone who was in the meeting who had the right and the obligation to enforce those ground rules. And it actually made a difference. I was pleasantly surprised. So having ground rules about meetings, having ground rules about what those conversations can be like can help. But there really has to be some willingness to change. And if that willingness to change isn't there, then to the target of the bullying, I say, you have a choice. Is this something you're going to choose to put up with because there are other things about the job that are worthwhile? But if the symbols of the messages to you are that it's not going to change, is it worth it, or should you be looking for something else? And that's an individual choice. And then lastly, what about people who are promoted based on favoritism? If there's a policy and that policy is violated and you're in a unionized setting, you can grieve that. Yeah. And if you're not in a unionized setting, you can at least complain that the policy was violated.
Yeah, I think we'll do 2 questions and I'll wrap up because we're over time. I'll just summarize one that just came in though. So somebody said, wow, so you're saying that the person being bullied may be the one that needs to find a new job. I think what I heard is just potentially, if the organization is not going to change, that behavior is not going to change, which means you're going to be in that situation. So you're not saying they have to find a new job, but they may want to consider what they may need to do if the organization is not going to change, because 80% of what would be considered bullying in that one of those first slides is not illegal.
Right.
So there's nowhere else to go if the organization's not going to make the commitment to it. Is there a different? Oh, go ahead.
Let me say, yes, you said it really well, Sean, and I just want to say, I believe it is morally wrong, but that it's like telling someone to get out of an abusive relationship. And it is wrong that the organization does that. But when I have someone in front of me who is stressed to the max and falling to pieces, I am telling them to prioritize their mental health over their job.
Yeah, good.
And yes, it is the organization's fault, but unfortunately, sometimes the individual is not going to get a good resolution within that organization. Yeah. And it's the organization's fault, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll ask you these 2 together. Is there a distinction between a toxic supervisor and an abusive supervisor? And then to just wrap up, are there any sample policies that you would point people toward?
I would say it's just a question of degree, abusive versus toxic. And I mean, I think that's really just a language thing, and that's not a distinction I would particularly use. And if you say it's a toxic environment, it's a toxic supervision, you kind of assume it affects more people than just one. Whereas an abusive supervisor, many of them just have, they just sort of focus on one person at a time, and they're not so abusive to the others. So to me, it's just a matter of a degree. So I don't know of a lot of really great policies, no. And but I'll tell you what, I'll do some work, and there won't be an answer to this later today, but I'll do some work and ask Sean to post something maybe in a
Yeah,
week or so.
we'd love to.
That'd be okay.
Absolutely, love to.
We do see some contract language about abusive supervision. And we've also seen some other contract language that tries to refer this to sort of a joint labor management committee or something like that.
Yeah.
But no, there's not really great policy
Yeah.
language about it out there.
Gotcha. Well, Michelle, I can't thank you enough for all of you that submitted questions. There were a lot of folks that participated today that are clearly dealing with some form of bullying or with abusive supervisors in their workplace. I apologize for not being able to get through those a little bit more. This is clearly a topic we might want to come back to. I think there's a lot of interest here from at least the group that follows along with us to kind of really highlight these issues. If you do find or we come up with a sample policy, that might be one we come back to and talk about this issue again, just to allow people the time to talk with you and ask you questions about how you kind of manage some of these situations. There were a few questions from HR folks that are kind of like, how do you manage, you know, when the investigation doesn't line up with complaints and a few other things. So we would love to get to those, but for the sake of your time, and thank you so much, Professor, for hanging over for an extra 10 minutes. We appreciate you all joining us. You'll be seeing this again in a couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you in about a month.